Good evening, everyone. As I just mentioned, my name is Jamil Mouawad, and I teach politics at the PSPA department here at AUB. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Beirut Urban Lab and Bobst-AUB Collaborative Initiative. Today, of course, as you all know, we're discussing Professor Mark Beissinger. Is that how you pronounce it? Beissinger. The book is entitled, as you can see, The Revolutionary City, Urbanization and the Global Transformation of Rebellion, which is published with Princeton University Press last year in 2022. This panel is important for at least two reasons. First, because we have the opportunity to discuss the book. I read the book, not all of it, because it's a very thick book in terms of volume. It's a 500-page book, but it's a very, very rich book in terms of methodology, but also content. It's really a compelling book because it puts the city center stage in understanding the revolution, but also it highlights the role of the centrality of the city and understanding the revolution, but also it puts the revolution center stage in understanding the city. The second reason why this panel is extremely important is because we're discussing this book in Beirut, a city that witnessed popular uprisings or protests only 4 years ago. It talks directly to a key concept of the book that is of revolutionary episode, inspired by the work of Charles Tilly. But also it's important because we're discussing this book in Beirut, because Beirut is the epitome of inequality, concentration of wealth and power, and of course marginalization, which is the reason why, as per the book, these revolutions take place. So not that I'm predicting the future of some upcoming revolutions in Beirut, but if they will happen, as per the book again, they will definitely happen in Beirut because Beirut is the urban city. And I quote from the book, given the continuing concentration of people, power and wealth in cities, the future of revolution will undoubtedly remain predominantly urban. So everyone expect another maybe revolution in Beirut and other cities. Thanks, Mark, for being with us. I'll just introduce you and the two discussants. Professor Beissinger is Henry Putnam Professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He previously served on the faculties of University of Wisconsin-Madison and Harvard University. His main fields of interest are social movements, revolutions, nationalism, state building, with a special reference to the former Soviet Union and the post-Soviet states. His recent research agenda focuses on the impact of new social media on new social media on opposition movements, the role of human error in revolution, civil society, and the resistance to democratic backsliding, and the relationship between nationalism and democracy. So welcome in Beirut, and we're happy to host you here at AUB. We have two discussants, Professor Mona Harb. She's a professor of urban studies and politics at the American University of Beirut, where she is also a co-founder and research lead at the Beirut Urban Lab, and this initiative is part of the many other initiatives that the Urban Lab are undertaking, especially when it comes to book discussions. Her research investigates urban governance and city making in context of disasters and the role of urban activities in collective action and oppositional politics. She's the author of a book entitled Le Hezbollah à Beyrouth de la banlieue à la ville. We also have, shall I stop? No. We also have Alexandra Kassir. Dr. Kassir is an incoming Assistant Professor of Sociology at the American University of Beirut. She holds a PhD in Sociology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and a Master's in Social and Cultural Psychology from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her main areas of research are social movements and grassroots mobilizations, social inequality, and migration. She examined the anti-sectarian movement in post-war Lebanon and its reconfigurations, the protest against headscarf ban in France, and more recently, the trajectories and experiences of young Palestinians and Syrian refugees in Lebanon. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamil, and I guess the images will come up here later on. But I just want to thank, first of all, AUB for inviting me back after having been here once before. And secondly, of course, the Beirut Urban Lab for hosting me as well. And Mona, as well as Alexandria for reading the book. It's a big book, so it took them a little while and a little work to get through it. But you'll be hearing about it today and get a sense of what's in it. I just happened to be in the neighborhood. I was in Cyprus, and so I suggested swinging by here to Beirut as a result of my proximity. So I'm glad I have this chance to talk to you about my book. So I began this project in 2010. It takes me a long time to write books. I tend to write big books, and they take a while because they're complex. I was invited in 2010 to a workshop conducted by historians. It was a workshop that was supposed to address the blank spots in our understanding of revolution. And there are many different things that were talked about at the workshop, but I was essentially assigned to discuss the relationship of violence to revolution. And, you know, my sense, and I think the sense of other people generally, was that violence over time, looked at in the long term, has generally been declining in revolutions. The problem was that we had no systematic data to be able to show that, if it were true. Plus, we would not know when that happened. You know, we didn't know how much less deadly revolutions maybe have become, if they have become less deadly. What factors might be associated with that. We have lots of data sets on civil wars around the world. There were no data sets when I began this project on revolution or revolutionary episodes. So I spent some time in the library to see how difficult it would be in order to create such a data set, and I basically came away with a sense that we would learn a lot by looking at global patterns of rebellion, a lot about how people change their government from below and their ability to do so. So that's what the book essentially is about. Here we go. So the book examines the evolution of political revolutions over roughly a century. It treats revolution, here I'm giving you my definition, it treats revolution essentially as a particular mode of regime change, one that differs from coups d'etats or foreign invasions aimed at regime change, in that in revolution a government is laid siege to not by a foreign army, not by its own military, but by its own population. And so I define a revolution as a mass siege of an established government by its own populations with the goals of displacing the incumbent regime and substantially altering the political or social order. Now, all revolutions come with two goals. One is to gain power, and the other is to bring about substantive change after power. And we really need to discuss both of them. You can't separate the two. And that's one of the things that the book does. So there is, of course, a vast literature on revolutions. And there are a number of ways in which this book is somewhat distinct. First of all, it's global in scope. It deals with revolutionary episodes around the world. It deals with them over the course of more than a century. So one gets to see how these have evolved over time. It theorizes the spatial dimension of revolution. It's the central theoretical notion of what I'm talking about in the book, and particularly it tries to theorize the role of the city Most of the theories that we have, particularly of social revolutions, which has dominated much of the scholarly talk about revolutions, most of that theory focuses on the rural society. But this book focuses on the city. It also focuses on the processes, outcomes, and consequences of revolution. So all three of those aspects, and I think most studies, focus on, one or two. It also tries to put together revolutions, the processes of revolutions, in a kind of complex way, interaction between structure and agency. I don't know how much I'll be able to talk about that today, but it's a central part of the book. So I put forth a kind of probabilistic approach to collective action. It's multidisciplinary, it's multi-method, it's quantitative, it's qualitative, and it brings to bear new sources of information on revolution that we really haven't had access to in the past. So speaking of that, the types of information that are used in the book are three streams of information. One is a data set that I put together based on that initial effort in the library to see whether it was worthwhile. It took me years to put this data together, though. 345 revolutionary episodes from 1900 to 2014. The latest Lebanese events are not part of the data set. It also utilizes a series of unusual public opinion surveys. Public opinion surveys from two revolutions in Ukraine in 2004 and 2014, as well as data from the Arab Barometer for Tunisia and Egypt. And those surveys provide a very detailed, systematic record of the attitudes, behaviors, and backgrounds of those participating in a revolution. Most of what we know about participants in revolutions historically has been on lists of those who have died or those who have been arrested. We really don't have a systematic sense of how they relate to the rest of society or who they are and what their attitudes are. These surveys are quite different, and I've given you some examples of what you can learn here on the slide. Essentially, it includes incredible detail on many of these participants. And not only that, but you can compare the participants with those who supported the revolution but didn't participate, which is very important, as well as to compare them with those who opposed the revolution. So the surveys provide us with a new level of detail about the participants of revolution. So finally, I won't be able to talk about it a lot, but there's extensive case material throughout the book, very qualitative. I go down into the spaces in which revolutionary episodes in cities unfold, and I talk about the sort of time and how it affects particular action in revolutionary contention through a lot of cases. So essentially, this book tells the story of the ways, as Jamil said, the ways in which the concentration of people, power, and wealth in cities has affected the incidence, practice, and consequences of political revolutions. As you know, the scale of urbanization over the last century has just been astounding. A total transformation of global society in many ways. So in 1900, 13% of the world's population was urban, and only 13 cities in the world in 1900 had more than 1 million people. By 2014, 54% of the world's population was urban, and there were 548 cities around the world with more than 1 million inhabitants. So that's a major, major transformation in the nature of society. Now, as the book argues, that transformation has had some profound effects on the ways in which people challenge regimes from below. It played a major role in rendering obsolete revolution's most theorized form, social revolutions. So Social revolutions were, as the sociologist Theda Skocpol says, they were rooted in what she calls agrarian bureaucratic society. This was a society in which a kind of landed elite had control over the labor of peasants. And there was a relationship between that landed elite and the state, a semi-bureaucratic state. And that, though, under particular conditions, that kind of society produced social revolutions. Social revolutions were aimed at transforming the class structure of society. And most theories of social revolution revolved around some aspect of this agrarian bureaucratic society and the conditions under which it produced revolution. However, as I describe in the book, by the late 20th century, this agrarian bureaucratic society was rapidly fading around the world. It was fading under the impact of urbanization, but also under the impact of development and under the impact of political change. Almost a third of the world's population experienced communism. That totally transformed the social structure of those societies. It wiped out that landed elite entirely. And we have land reform in many, many other places. So at the same time, urbanization helped to give rise to new patterns of mass revolt in cities. And I picture that here in the bottom image. Prior to 1985, 45% of revolutionary episodes in cities prior to 1985, only 45% of revolutionary episodes occurred in cities. And 70% of those episodes that occurred prior to 1985 were armed. They used weapons. Since 1985, more than 2/3 of revolutionary episodes have occurred in cities, and 73% of them have been unarmed. They've been unarmed, and in fact, revolution today has become a predominantly urban phenomenon, with most of these revolts based on the power of numbers rather than the power of arms. And that's the story, the transformation of that that is the story of the book, what I call in the book the urban civic repertoire. The urban civic repertoire, and I'll tell why I call it that shortly. So the book explores the increasing frequency of these urban civic revolutions, how they fueled a growth in the incidence of revolutionary contention around the world, because they have, and the processes and consequences that they bring about. So to fit all this together, I develop a theory, a spatial theory about revolution that's rooted in the differences between revolutionary processes in the countryside and revolutionary processes in the city. So revolutionary processes in the city are closely related to the role of cities as centers of state and economic power. That's where the state is concentrated. That's where the coercive forces of the state are concentrated. The state is strongest in cities. And so revolutionary movements in cities are highly vulnerable to repression. But it's also the case that that's where the nerve centers of government are concentrated. So regimes also are highly vulnerable to urban revolt. And what this does is it sets up a kind of trade-off, a kind of spatial trade-off between an opposition's ability to disrupt a government and its exposure to government repression. And I refer to that trade-off as the proximity dilemma. And you can see in nature similar sorts of trade-offs. Most of you probably know that predators concentrate in the same place where animals try to feed. That's the most conducive place for them to be, but it's also the most dangerous place for them to be. In that trade-off, which biologists call the growth versus predation risk trade-off, in that trade-off, animals figure out ways to manage this. They manage it in a number of ways. They, for instance, might alter how long they feed or the timing of feeding, or they might engage in herding behaviors or migratory behaviors, or they might devote a portion of their feeding time to vigilance in order to try to prevent themselves from being eaten. So the repression-disruption trade-off is different, but it has a similar kind of spatial trade-off in certain ways. So this repression-disruption trade-off in revolution can be managed by moving further away from government, often to the countryside, where you're safer at a further distance from the repressive capacities of the state, but it does that at a cost. It does that at the cost of being able to disrupt government directly. And there are other ways in which it can be managed, but just as in nature, this repression-disruption trade-off in revolution can be influenced by structural changes in the environment, big structural changes in the environment, like the effects of climate change on nature, much like that. So those might render oppositions more vulnerable to repression or less vulnerable or more capable of exerting influence over government and vice versa. So the effects of those changes in the environment are felt most intensely in cities. These are things like technological change and innovation, changes in the character of government, global economic and geopolitical forces. But urbanization has also more directly affected this repression-disruption trade-off. And it's done that by concentrating large numbers of people in close proximity to centers of power. It has connected them in new ways, and it's produced new spaces, which I'll talk about, and social forces that are involved in challenging regimes. Now, as I show in the book, this proximity dilemma has some very profound effects on revolutionary contention. So, for example, violence has opposite effects on outcomes, revolutionary outcomes, in rural and urban revolutions. So in rural revolutions, more violence is associated with a higher likelihood of opposition victory, and in cities, it's precisely the opposite. More violence is associated with a lower probability of opposition victory. And Engels already recognized this by the end of the 19th century in the quote that I provide here. So this is not something that I'm discovering anew. It's something that, at least in cities, that has been known for quite a while. So this proximity dilemma also helps explain why numbers don't matter that much for the outcomes of rural revolutions. So not only is scaling up in rural revolutions difficult, given that population densities are much lower, but it's also the case that when you have crowds in rural revolutions, they're located far away from centers of government. They can't exert any influence on centers of government. And so they don't threaten regimes as directly. But as I show here for urban revolutions, which are the ones on urban episodes, the ones on the right, and basically what this shows is the 50-50 point, the 0.50 probability. That's a flip of a coin as to whether opposition is going to win or not. And you can see on the left, for rural revolutions, numbers don't matter really much at all. There's hardly any relationship between numbers and outcomes. But for urban revolutions, there is a relationship. But it's only really at very high numbers that you have some kind of sense of security, some kind of sense of assuredness that you would win. You have to mobilize very large numbers to truly tip the odds. So here's where urbanization transformed revolutionary possibilities. Take, for instance, the city of Kiev, city I know pretty well. Kiev experienced multiple revolutionary episodes over the course of the 20th century, and continues to. In 1905, the population of Kiev could not have carried out the massive mobilizations that you see here in 2004 in what was called the Orange Revolution. It just simply didn't have enough people to do that. In 1905, the population of Kiev was 330,000. That would mean basically mobilizing every single inhabitant, which is usually pretty impossible. And, but by 2004, it had a population of 2.7 million. And that was a propitious base for mobilizing crowds of hundreds of thousands and even up to 1 million people in what came to be called the Orange Revolution. So there are other reasons why the power of numbers was not an available strategy before the late 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, governments were more likely to shoot into crowds or to ride over them with cavalry. Deaths in unarmed rebellions in cities were on average 6 times greater in the first half of the 20th century than in the post-Cold War period. And as a result, revolutionary demonstrations, in the early part of the 20th century and through the mid-20th century, they had to arm themselves in order to protect themselves from repression. So that's one reason. And as technologies for non-lethal crowd control clicked in and began to be developed, which occurred in the mid-20th century, that greatly affected, the risks that people were taking in revolution. Also, it was the fact that you simply couldn't hear people in large crowds prior to the mid-20th century. So it wasn't until the mid-20th century when the Nazis applied sound amplification to street rallies that you could actually hear people at more than 10 meters in large crowds. And then also, due to the constraints of communication systems, revolutionary movements in cities relied on very localized neighborhood and factory networks. And all of that limited the size of mobilizations. But by the late 20th century, changes in communication and the proliferation of large, resourced, and highly networked populations in close proximity to state nerve centers of power basically tipped the nature of the trade-off function for revolutions in favor of urban oppositions. And that's what I argue in the book. So, in addition to documenting those changes, the book also looks at the processes that occur within urban revolutions. So because proximity to state centers of power heightens the costs and risks involved in revolution, it turns urban revolutions into highly condensed conflicts. Now I know that these two graphs look pretty similar, but look at the axes here, and you can see one goes up to 1,000 days and the other one goes up to 15,000 days. So urban revolutions are highly concentrated in time. And they're highly concentrated because both regimes and those who are rebelling are highly at risk. So one of the consequences of the proximity dilemma that I was talking about is this concentration in time. And this compression of time in urban revolutions creates significant information problems for people. I don't know how many of you have played the game of chess with a time clock. There is actually a word for this in German. It's called Zeitnot, time trouble. When you make mistakes because you're under the pressure of the clock, right? Well, that happens very frequently in urban revolutions. Urban revolutions are replete with lots of mistakes. But it's also the fact that and a lot of them have to do with just not knowing what's going on, and rumor and so on. But errors are not only more likely in urban revolutions than they are in rural revolutions, they are also more consequential. They're more consequential because they are in close proximity to centers of power. There is no place to hide. There is no place to hide in an urban revolution. In rural revolutions, you have the distance. Both government and rebels have distance from which to recover, and I give some examples of that in the book. But in urban revolutions, you can't recover. You have no possibility of doing so. The consequences of mistakes are direct and immediate. So I show this in the book through a lot of actual examples. Let's see if I can, there we go. So the book also contrasts the spatial dimensions of rebellion in rural revolts and urban armed revolts with those of these revolts that depend on the power of numbers. The spatial elements of these urban civic revolutions, as I call them. So in contrast to urban armed revolts, which as you can see, they try to use the cityscape much like rural rebels use rough terrain. They try to create rough terrain in order to hide. Urban civic revolutions that depend on the power of numbers, they use the spaces between buildings. So they don't hide from government repression. They occur in full view of the nation and in full view of the world and in full view of the police. In fact, visibility is one of the factors that they're trying to use to their advantage. So with the rise of television and the internet, as we know, visuality, simultaneity, transnationality have become increasingly central to revolutionary processes. Now, I'm going a little too far here. It just took a little while for this one to load. So, as states have proliferated around the world, as they have consolidated around the world, and as urbanization has preceded, these large open spaces in close proximity to power have proliferated as well, especially in capital cities. So Kiev's Maidan, this is pictures of Kiev's Maidan. In 1918 from a German aerial photo, and in 2017, as you can see, it's spatially quite different. It was rebuilt after World War II. During World War II, it was completely destroyed by the war, and then was rebuilt into this more open space. Why? Largely as a parade ground for the Soviet regime in order to glorify the Soviet state. The October Revolution, May Day Revolution, those became the dates on which the parades went through, right through that square. And that space became turned around in some ways. It got reused for purposes of challenging the state rather than glorifying the state. And this is a story that replicates itself around the world in terms of the construction of these large open spaces and the repurposing of these large urban spaces. When states build these large spaces, they don't think they're going to be used to challenge them, but they have that potential because they're large open spaces in close proximity to centers of power. So I explore this in the book. I do a number of things. I look at how the space is made and remade over time. I look at how the shape and availability of that space affects the nature of the interactions between rebels and regimes, revolutionaries and regimes. I look at what the strategies, the spatial strategies that regimes use in order to contain revolution. So one of the things that they try to do is to make these urban civic revolutions, to dislocate them away from the centers of the city, away from the nerve centers of government in particular. They push them to the periphery of the cities. This was a story that unfolded multiple times during the Arab Spring revolts. Much of revolutionary contention today, urban revolutionary contention, is a struggle for control over public space. Who controls that space, particularly public space, in close proximity to nerve centers of power? So then I look at the surveys that I mentioned to you before. And these revolutions that try to concentrate hundreds of thousands of people in a very short period of time, in a matter of days and weeks, as these revolutions do, they necessarily draw on a wide variety of grievances and political forces. So to maximize numbers in a concentrated period of time, these revolutions typically forge a broad negative coalition. A coalition that basically has consensus only about kicking government out. It has no consensus over values, over what should happen after revolution. This comes down to trying to rely on the power of numbers because you have to mobilize as many people as possible in order to do that. They also rely on very hastily constructed and assembled leaderships. Sometimes they have no leadership whatsoever. They use an inclusive civic nationalism in order to hold themselves together. They articulate broadly minimalist demands, civic demands. This is why I call these them as urban civic revolutions. This is a kind of least common denominator that cuts across the divides within society. So what happened in Lebanon is really not that different from what happened elsewhere around the world. And the surveys used in the book show that the participants in urban civic revolution are actually much more diverse. They're much more diverse in their political identities than those who support these revolutions but don't participate, and those who oppose the revolution. So assembling the crowd is creating a diversity. So urban civic revolutions are often interpreted as democratic revolutions, but as these surveys show, corruption and economic issues are usually the most frequently cited reasons for why people participate in these revolutions, rather than trying to attain political freedoms. Political freedoms are cited only by a minority. They are cited by a group of those who participate, but by a third or less of those who participate. So the surveys provide a number of examples of weak commitment to democratic values among revolutionary participants. So for instance, only 33% of Orange Revolution participants and 52% of Euromaidan participants believed that Ukraine needed a multi-party system. I don't know how you construct a democracy when you don't have a multi-party system, but it's very, very, very difficult, obviously. One of the reasons why I call these urban civic rather than democratic revolutions is because the commitment to democracy is often quite weak among those who participate. They're more about what people are mobilizing against than what they're mobilizing for. They're mobilizing against repressive and corrupt government rather than for democracy. So finally, and I'll stop here, the book provides one of the first systematic treatments of what happens after revolutions, and it examines the effects of revolutions on political order, on economic growth, successful revolutions I'm talking about, on economic growth, on inequality, on political freedoms, on government accountability, success, at least in terms of the opposition coming to power. So I show, for instance, that these revolutions, these urban civic revolutions, because they involve a hastily constructed negative coalition, urban civic revolutions produce post-revolutionary governments that are less coherent, less durable than governments brought to power by social revolutions. And while successful urban civic revolutions do lead to some substantial improvements in political freedoms relative to pre-revolutionary times, these achievements fall short of the average democracy, minimally defined average democracy, and they tend to deteriorate over time after the revolution. Moreover, these urban civic revolutions inherit the pre-revolutionary state, largely intact with all of its corrupt relationships, and as a result, corruption remains at a very high level after revolution. And as you can see here, not in this graph, this figure over here on the right, not that much different than pre-revolutionary times, not that much different than urban civic revolutions that fail, and far, far, far higher than the average for all electoral democracies minimally defined. So these revolutions also lead to sluggish economic growth and to greater economic inequality. So this gives you a sense of what I cover in the book. So my goals in writing this book essentially were to explain how and why revolution has evolved over time, to develop a theory of revolution that's relevant for the urban world that we live in, not the agrarian bureaucratic societies, and to elucidate the spatial dimensions of rebellion, and also to bring to bear some new forms of information to the study of revolution that we've largely ignored up to this time. So hopefully I've given you a sense of that, and I look forward to Mona and Alexandra's comments on the book. So.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss this fantastic book. I very much enjoyed reading it. And I learned tremendously from it. I'm going to share a few notes about it. I believe this is a reference book that will become an indispensable read in every syllabus and in every academic source, speaking of violence, revolution, and cities. It's also a massive book. I wish I had a real copy. I wanted to see how thick it is. It's more than 500 pages. It's actually, you do have a copy. Who else than Ali would get it? Yeah. So it's a book that's close to 600 pages. It's really a feat. I think it's been ages I haven't read such a big book. And I don't think I'll do justice to all the layers of information embedded in it. It's really impossible to do that in 15 minutes. And I think you've done an amazing job of presenting how rich it is. So I believe the book succeeds masterfully at doing what it promises to do in its very early pages, following the footsteps of really the godfather analyst of revolutions, Charles Tilly, namely building concrete and historical analysis of the big structures and large processes that shape our era. And I'm quoting what Professor Beissinger says in his preface. So as you saw, it's a book organized in 10 chapters, and it investigates what's the impact of the concentration of people, power, wealth in cities, and what is this impact on the incidence, practice, and consequences of political revolutions. So this is, I've felt while reading the book that we don't have social revolutions anymore. We're in the era of political revolutions. It's a very important shift in our understanding of what revolutions are and what are the qualifiers we use to talk also about revolutions. So 600 pages, almost, more than 400 pages of text, more than 100 figures and tables to discover. You've seen a few of them today. 4 annexes that provide very precious information about the book's methodology and the construction of the data set of the book, which is a huge contribution to knowledge on social movements. I don't know if we still can call them social movements, political movements perhaps.
They are social movements that turn into...
Yeah. But at least collective action, organizing, all this. So as you've seen, 345 revolutionary episodes across the world over 110 years. And these are selected on the basis of those that reached a peak mobilization of 1,000 participants. So it gives you an idea about also what they include. All the episodes are listed in one of the annexes if you'd like to discover them. There are also more than 130 episodes that are not included, so you can also see others, close to 500 episodes over the century that is covered. You also understand, if you're interested, the probabilistic models used in the chapter. I cannot say that I did, but they are undoubtedly an essential component for students who work on these quantitative methods and that are interested in building such models. And you have close to 60 pages of references. So if you want to update your literature on what has been happening in that field, it's a mine of information. If you don't have time to read the book, because we're also dealing with people who don't read very much these days, the introduction is amazing. So you can really read the introduction and you get a very, very good idea about what the book's thesis is about and its main contributions and what's the impact of urbanization on revolution over these 110 years. I think I'm aware a bit of time, but yeah, maybe I'll go over this very quickly. The book has a theoretical chapter, a historical discussion. Then you have 2 chapters that explain the model and the data set, the models, I would say, and that focus more on the structural conditions of revolutions in cities and how they evolved. Then you have about 3 chapters, I think, that are more qualitative and that underscore how urban civic revolutions are very much made and unmade through what Professor Beissinger calls the playfulness of events in the city. I really like this a lot, that idea of revolution being a game, and I think the metaphor of chess, but also of a timed chess game is a very good one, because it encapsulates that concentration, that condensed time you were talking about as well. So that playfulness and that and how it unfolds in the public spaces of the city, and this is very interesting for urbanists and geographers in the room, and I'm happy to see that they form a majority of the room over the rest of the crowd. So the agency of these individual participants, the looseness of their coalitions, you get to understand how it affects the interactions with the regime and the counter-revolutionary powers as well, how they unfold. There are 2 chapters on the outcomes of these revolutions, very interesting on how they're leading to fewer deaths, it was mentioned earlier, and how their results are very mixed in terms of consequences on society at the political and economic level as well. And the last chapter is a very interesting and rich speculation on the futures of revolution in the urban world, noting how they will continue to grow and evolve, and it provides what I thought was a very realistic outlook regarding how, in the context of geopolitical shifts, regimes will be investing in repressive ways of countering the power of numbers in cities. And I think the Arab region is seeing this in very salient ways. We're seeing it in Tunisia and Egypt even earlier, and even Lebanon has joined that group of more and more autocratic regimes. So I want to just summarize like 4 takeaways I noted, and I really selected them very much informed by my positionality as a scholar of urban politics, also as someone who has been an occasional urban activist and participated in some of these revolutions, and who experienced the counter-revolutions in quite violent ways as well, and the disillusions that you mentioned, and the disenchantments that come with that after the end of revolutionary episodes that are not successful, if you want to think about power takeover. And I was counting that it's been about 20 years we've been doing this in the streets of that city. It's a lot of time. So I will also share 2 comments and a personal reflection. So first, I think the spatial theory of revolution that you propose on how spatial location influences revolutionary processes over time, the proximity dilemma, is a very productive thesis that will be very widely used by a lot of us and a lot of scholars and students. It's very capacious, it's very strong. It really shows that dilemma of how participants to revolutions need to leverage, and I'm quoting here, the disruptive power of revolutionary movements to induce regime collapse, while also warding off regime repression. Very difficult challenge. I don't know how it's possible to be done, but it really encapsulates the difficulty of what needs to be done. The second takeaway, and I'm going over very quickly to also give some points for Alexandra to comment on as well. I think this is my favorite chapter in the book, chapter 5. This is when the book moves to more the qualitative discussion. It's a book that starts with a quotation by Henri Lefebvre, who's of course the godfather of critical urban studies, which we uphold a lot in the program and the lab I'm associated in, that reminds us of the street as disorder, and it's taken from the Urban Revolution book. This is a chapter that highlights the dynamic, iterative, interactive character to revolutionary contention and the crucial role of agency in the process. So not only structural constraints, but also the importance of agency in determining processes and outcomes. This is where we understand what is meant by the playful processes and revolution, their speed, intensity, and compactness as very important dimensions that will increase the impact of contingency and miscalculation on revolutionary outcomes. this is a chapter where you're reading and you're always like, as someone who knows what happened in Lebanon, you're always nodding and saying, oh, yeah, oh, right, oh, yes. And you're always saying like, oh, this is how we can theorize what we experienced. It's an amazing chapter in doing that, like 4 years later, when you read this and you're like, okay, so that's a pattern. It's not only here, as you were saying earlier. So it's sad in many ways, actually. I'll come back to that. It's you read it, you're not really happy about what you're reading and seeing that it's a trend and it's a pattern. So it shows really that urban civic revolutions produce condensed conflicts and surprises that often lead to mistakes, errors that were mentioned in your presentation earlier, and tensions that become magnified and that lead to irreversible consequences at the expense, really, of revolution. And I wanted to add here of ideology even. I mean, there's not a lot of ideology anyway in what you describe. And very interestingly, Professor Beissinger shows us that previous revolutions, the rural ones, were much more tolerant of errors, and they let protesters make more mistakes and manage their ways through them. And it's a very interesting observation. So this amplified contingency generates these unpredictable moments, sudden and unanticipated events, in addition to a lot of things related to information, so rumor, miscalculation, coincidence, that will directly affect and transform the momentum and trajectory of a rebellion and its direct impact on outcome. So we see here how contingent urban revolutions are and unpredictable in many ways, and how they can lead to these surprising outcomes that can change completely the course of a process of revolution. The third takeaway is on the participants. And again here, it's very remarkable to note that these participants form a small minority of society. So it again aligns with what we know in the case of Lebanon. And that there are significant segments of society that do not participate to revolution, either because they're against it or because they're apathetic and they're not interested. Again, very similar. I mean, we don't have numbers for Lebanese revolutions. I don't know how to construct a data set on what's happening here. I know Rima Majid is trying to construct one, so maybe we'll have more data to document what she's trying to show and align it on the data you share. But I think from anecdotal observations, it aligns with what you're saying on that participants are educated urban middle classes in majority, and that they rally, as you said in the presentation, around their shared hostility against the regime rather than around shared democratic values and principles, and or even agreement on policy issues, which is something I think we experienced a lot and we saw, and there are studies that demonstrate this, and we're seeing it almost every day in Lebanon through the splintering happening to the very small coalition that came after the 2019 elections, the parliamentary election, and that's now no more a coalition even. So where we really see how these disagreements materialized in fragmentation, diminished coordination, and I'm quoting you here, and diluted collective identities. The final takeaway I'll mention is this issue of do revolutions matter? And here it's a mixed answer, really. It shows that the outcomes of civic urban revolutions are mixed and fragile. They're precarious and uncertain. Not many of them succeed, and when they do, their impact is not durable. There's some progress, but there's also a lot of like one step back, 1 step forward and 10 steps back. So it's not very steady over time. There are regressions that happen in some sectors, especially when we look at economic growth and income inequality. We saw some samples of there. So I try to do some critique, but that's almost impossible to do with what I've read. But I'll try. I mean, I'm sure there will be readers who say this is an attempt of the book to generalize and it's too ambitious. And I think you mentioned this very clearly in the introduction, preemptively as well. It's a smart way of countering that basic critique that will come to the book. I actually don't agree with it if anyone would do it. I'm someone who doesn't work on multiple cases and on comparative cases. I'm a scholar who worked on Lebanon and micro cases, and I was very happy reading your book because it pays really an impressive attention to detail, to individual cases. There's a lot of information about agency, effect, relations, intersections, even ambiguities and tensions. We really capture them. So for me, this is really the work I'm going to say the work more of a political sociologist almost, not the political scientist in the US sense of political science. So I really enjoyed that dimension in the book. I'll just make 2 comments, and that they're mainly on the chapter that concerns me most, chapter 6, which connects to my own work. So I also wrote a short chapter for the book edited by Rima Majed and Jeffrey Karam on the Lebanon 2019 uprising, and I called it something like Urban Space Matters to Revolutions. So I'm totally aligned on your thesis in that book, and I was reading it and I'm like, yes, check, check, check. We are quite aligned in terms of the arguments you make and I make, and I just have 2 comments on that. So in the chapter I wrote, I used the spatial triad of Henri Lefebvre, that understanding of social space as being conceived, perceived, and lived. And I found it very productive to explain how the urban space in the city is produced by hegemonic dominating power, the regime. And Lefebvre explains that people are going to practice that space, but also live it and reappropriate it, and according to their heart's desire, as he calls it in the original French version of the book even. And he shows that the state is not going to allow this to happen, and they're going to reappropriate that space and redominate it and reproduce it as conceived space. And for me, that's a very fertile framework through which to explain these processes through which that you explain, where the state is going to push people outside of the city to the periphery, or erase a square, or privatize it and make it into a commercial space, and you explain that beautifully. So I was wondering if you would also think that this is a productive lens to be used, and what would be your thoughts on that? The second comment I would make is again taken from what I wrote in that chapter. So in the chapter, I make the same argument you make, that urban space matters, that protesters appropriate 3 types of urban spaces. I make a typology of them: public open space, abandoned buildings, and infrastructure. And I also show, like you do, that the importance of symbolic spaces is super important. I add to that an idea that I borrow from Eric Olin Wright's Real Utopias, and I also argue that it works really well to be in the city because the city provides us with these performative stages that are prefigurative of the real utopias that Wright argues for as important for political change. And I try to show that what we observed in Beirut and Tripoli, in a number of central city spaces or intermediary city spaces, were also these performative stages of prefiguration that help people imagine together another type of living together, or of collectivity, which failed miserably after with the counter-revolution. But for a moment, that was also the magic that you talk about in some of your chapters. And I'm wondering why in your book you did not mobilize this idea of political imaginary, of imagination, of utopia. I started looking for this keyword and I didn't find it there prominently, and I'm wondering if you can discuss that in your comments. Okay, so to close, I'm sorry it might have taken more time than I was allocated. But for me, I mean, this is a very engaging book. You know it by now. It's a very powerful book. It's a book that will speak to many disciplines: historians, political scientists, sociologists, geographers, urbanists, even economists will enjoy it. It's a very also accessible book, and in that sense, it's a feat. It's not easy to make a book that's also very scholarly and academic, but that's also a very pleasant read, easy read in many ways. So you flip through it and you enjoy reading it if you're a non-specialist reader. It made me think that it's going to be very useful to the policy advisors of the counter-revolutionary forces who are going to really identify very well how to reclaim the spaces claimed by the revolutionaries. They know it already, of course they do. But finally, I think, and that's the more sad note I will end with, unfortunately, because these are also difficult times to live in and to experience for many people around the world, but also here. So it's a book in many ways that I found very inspiring, because it made me feel like, oh, the struggle will continue. There will always be people who will oppose the predatory regimes and the corrupt regimes. And of course, we have a predatory and corrupt regime. And we will find a number of people who will rally together against them and do the next round of struggle. But at the same time, when you read the book, you realize that even if they will rally, there will not be a strong coalition. They will not rally around the same values and policy issues that they need to rally around. And that would most likely, in a context like Lebanon, where we have so much division on multiple fronts, most likely it will not lead to change, or even the prospects of change are so constrained that one wonders, like, is it worth trying even? Which is like the question that I think many revolutionaries in Lebanon today are asking. And we have a preview of what the opposition coalition is doing today. I think Jamil can talk a lot about this later as well. I don't know if it takes time to more revolutionary episodes to mature in that, and sharing more sets of values or what, but for me this is a question that stays open, and that if we want to be a bit more optimistic about prospects, that I will cling to, although I didn't really feel that the book gives me these prospects to cling to, but you know, if we want to continue that journey, we need to cling to something. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much again to Lara and to the Bobst-AUB Center for giving us that opportunity at BUL to share this book and to host you, Professor Beissinger, here.
Oh, I thought you wanted to.
Maybe you give some, your comments, and then Mark can.
Yeah.
Like 5 minutes before. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, really, thank you again for this invitation, and I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. Before I start, I want to thank you again for this data set. We talked about it earlier, but it really, as I was telling Mark before, even before finishing reading the book, I had to stop, to pause, to check the data set, and really to resist the urge to start playing with the data, basically. So it's important to, I just want to emphasize the importance, value, not only of compiling this remarkable and much needed data set, but also of making it accessible. And I think this is something that is much needed and very important. So, in my intervention, I want to concentrate on some of the new directions the revolutionary city offers us for the study of revolution and the perspective it opens also for further research. And so I will particularly concentrate on some of the theoretical and methodological aspects, and I also have a few questions that I would like to raise. You just mentioned at the beginning of your presentation and in your book as well that the work on this project began essentially in 2010 during a workshop on the blank spots in our knowledge of revolutions. And you explained that at the time you were particularly interested in the relation between violence and revolution. So today, if we come back to this initial question that somehow that somehow incited you to start writing this book, we could easily say that The Revolutionary City indeed addresses many of the blank spots in our understanding of revolution beyond the initial question you were interested in, which actually address in chapter 8, which is the question of violence. So I'll come back to that in a second, but I would say that if the revolutionary city provides a unique understanding of contemporary revolutions, of why they happen, how they unfold, it is precisely because it challenges many artificial boundaries that unfortunately, to a large extent, still plague the literature on social, on revolution and actually on social movements as well. So I'm referring here to the disciplinary boundaries, but also to the split and tensions in the existing literature between different theoretical traditions, levels of analysis, which are also reflected at the methodological level. So I'm particularly thinking of the two dominant approaches in the study of revolutions. So on the one hand, the theory focusing on the structural condition as the main, if not the sole, basically determinant of revolution. So the group of scholars essentially arguing, and to use Theda Skocpol's word, that revolutions are not made, but they come. And the critique of this structural determinist approach, who would actually emphasize more the processes by which revolutions unfold. And so this approach would focus more on agency, and they seek to further understand the activist motivations, intentions, strategic choices, etc. They would also focus on questions such as leadership, alliance building, and on different organizational, ideological, and strategic elements to understand the course of revolution. And this is also translated in different levels of analysis, either focusing on the micro level, the micro foundations and dynamics of revolutions, or those treating revolutions basically as macro-social events produced by different historical forces and transformation. And so by adopting a multidisciplinary approach and by combining different methods and articulating different scales of analysis, the revolutionary city avoids many of these pitfalls in the existing literature and provides a unique understanding of the causes, processes, and outcomes of contemporary revolutions. And I would like to highlight 3 of them here. First is the articulation between different scales of analysis to capture the evolution of the processes and outcomes of political revolutions over roughly a century. Second, the integration of structure and agency into a single framework to understand the onset of revolutions. You mentioned that very briefly, but I think it's super important in this book, and I was like so happy to see it. And third, the thorough analysis of the outcomes of revolution, an area which to a large extent remains understudied in the existing literature. So first, the title of the book suggests urbanization and the global transformation of rebellion. This book adopts a global outlook. It is global in its goals and scope of inquiry. It compiles a global records of revolution that we just talked about, and aims to offer an understanding of the global patterns of revolution and the transformation. Yet it doesn't fall into what players, for example, refer to as methodological globalism, to contrast it with methodological nationalism, in the sense that there's a tendency to consider that the main explanatory factors of social phenomenon only lies at the global scale. On the contrary, the revolutionary city doesn't only focus on global mechanisms and force, assume that they would be expressed similarly in different countries with only minor and slight variations due to the national context, but it remains very attentive to the specificities of individual cases and articulates different levels of analysis by drawing on different types of material that you discussed in your presentation. The unique global records of 345 revolutionary episodes around the world between 1900 and 2014, and by using statistical inferences to identify different patterns, by including in the data set the detailed narrative of each revolutionary episode, so combining this qualitative approach, and by relying on extensive case material from different revolutions around the world that you actually refer to and discuss thoroughly throughout the book, and by using these 4 public opinion survey that you just talked about to analyze individual participation. So by articulating these different scales of the analysis, the global, the revolutionary episodes happening at the national scale and the individual, the revolutionary city is able to capture global trends, but also gives a unique insight of different critical changes in the patterns of revolution and the factors at the different levels associated with them. And this thorough knowledge of the evolutions of the process and outcomes of revolution over roughly a century also allow us to understand individual cases. And exactly as you were just saying, I was saying, oh, we could relate to this so much, and we're not an exception, basically. And I really think activists, for example, who would read the book would very much relate to many of the discussion, for example, that I had with them. Reflecting on what was happening in the streets and afterwards. So this brings me to the second point, which is the integration of structure and agency into a single framework to understand the onset of revolution. So in the probabilistic approach that you develop, the distinction between the probability of revolution onset and the actual materialization of revolution is essential. So in other words, here the structural condition only translates into chances and risks, and not as the structural determinist approach would say into actual outcomes. And necessarily, I mean, into outcomes. And precisely because of the role of human action, of agency, which is needed for a revolution to materialize. And so here you also very much unpack the role played by contingency, by error, and by this interaction between the regime and the opposition. And you discuss in the book the beautiful analogy with the hurricane that you didn't mention here, but I really loved it. So it's not you didn't see a revolution as earthquake or wildfire, but it more as the hurricanes. And the third contribution I would like to emphasize is the thorough analysis of the outcomes of revolution. As I said, this area which remains to a large extent kind of understudies, particularly as you mentioned also when it comes to analyzing the outcomes of failed revolutions. So it's chapter 9, which is dedicated to this challenging task. And it examined the critical period following revolutions through multiple comparisons, through counterfactual analysis, which I found really interesting. And in this way, the outcomes of revolutions are not just reduced to the achievements of the post-revolutionary governments, but really to analyze them, you take into account the conditions of the society that the revolutionary inherit, basically, and also you compare it to the patterns of similar societies where revolutions do not happen. So it's a very interesting analysis, and this very nuanced analysis would reveal how many of the factors that in fact aid urban civic revolution in seizing powers actually hinders the prospects of substantive changes in their wake. And this is also something we could really relate to when we think about the 2019 Thawra here in Lebanon. But beside this multidimensional framework the Revolutionary City provides for the study of revolution, the book also offers a spatial theory of revolution. The core argument is that location matters and profoundly affect the nature, the rhythm, the mobilization processes, and the outcomes of revolution. So it theorizes the returns of the city as a site for revolution, and particularly for the urban civic revolution, which is the most common form it took since the end of the 20th century, as you demonstrate in the book. And you discuss how this large-scale urbanization has altered the characters and outcomes of revolutionary contention. And here, this brings me to my first question. So, urbanization processes are not homogeneous. And clearly, and if we use a data set that you compile to draw a map of revolution throughout time, we could also see the absence of revolution in certain parts of the world and identify certain cities where revolutions didn't happen. For example, I've been particularly thinking about the very big cities in the global south that didn't witness, I mean, until now, there were not big sites of revolution. And I guess this might be related to the participation of the urban poor, which tend to remain, their participation tend to remain relatively limited compared to that of the urban middle class in urban civic revolution, as you show. Although this does not mean that the urban poor are not challenging the establishment in other way and engaging in other forms of resistance, but their participation in revolution tend to be relatively limited. Or maybe it's related to the also related to the proximity dilemma, which, as you show, shapes the revolutionary process in profound ways. So maybe part of the explanation, it's just like a hypothesis, I was just like thinking about it, is linked to the fact that in these very big cities, there are also spaces that are not accessible to the state. Certain neighborhoods, for example. So maybe this could be related to that. So I've been thinking about this absence of revolution essentially in these big cities, these mega cities, but also about the possible shape revolution could take if they were to happen in this city. Would it be more like armed rebellion or more peaceful? I know it's very difficult to predict, but these were some of the questions I was thinking of while reading it. And my second question is also about cities, but now about the role of small cities. So you discussed the critical role of capital cities and the strategic location they offer. But I've been thinking about the role of smaller cities, which somehow remain on the margin of analysis, although in many revolutionary episodes they played an important role. I'm thinking of the 2011 uprising, for example. They played an important role. So I was thinking about that as well and see what are your thoughts. My third question is about the role of counter-revolutionary forces. So in your analysis, you focus very much on the interaction between the state and the opposition, the revolutionary. And the urban civic revolutions are understood, as you show in the book, as revolution against a repressive and abusive regime. They are targeting the government in place. But as you showed also, they are not necessarily revolutions for democracy. And so this would make them very vulnerable to different counter-revolutionary forces. And so I've been thinking that beside the state repression that they are subject to, how we could bring that into the analysis and integrate the role of these different counter-revolutionary forces. My last point, just very quickly, is connected to my own work on what I call the backstage of revolution. So. In my study on the 2019 October uprising, the Thawra in Lebanon, I call it backstage because I'm interested in the less visible spaces of mobilizations where many things happen before, during, but also after the spectacular, extraordinary moment of mobilization. But beyond the specific case of Lebanon, as I was going through your data set, I was wondering how it could be used to further understand the articulation between the extraordinary, spectacular moment of revolution, when population really attempt to force regime change from below, and the more ordinary moments, if I can put it this way, of everyday life, where population might also attempt to challenge the status quo, but in less visible way. So I've been thinking about ways through which we could combine maybe this data set with other data we might have, for example, ethnographic studies, to get insight into the articulation between the different forms of engagement, and try to capture not only the relation between revolutions and social movement and visible social movements, which are very visible, and this relation is very clear. It is often clear, I mean, between the two, but also the articulation with other forms of grassroots activism, which might use different ways to reclaim, for example, the right to the city, and strive to reclaim in different ways the public sphere. So I think this could be useful to capture the different reconfigurations that could unfold. So, for example, from an invisible small grassroots efforts to social movement to revolution, but also to understand the reconfiguration that could happen after the revolutionary moments, where activists could rechannel their energy into other things, basically. So, these are just like a few thoughts, and thank you very much again.
Thanks, Alexandra. We may now take 5 minutes maybe to address some of the comments, or and then.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief because I know there might be questions, and I want to give time to the audience. But these were very, very rich comments, and I can't do justice in replying to them. So they were wonderful comments, and I thank you for them all. And I don't have answers for all of them. Even in a 500 or 600 page book. So there's much more work to be done on revolution than can be fit into a 500 to 600 page book. So let me just take a couple of these things. Also, let me just say, the book was obviously written, well, before the Lebanese situation. I didn't have the Lebanese situation in mind as I wrote it. And I'm not a specialist on the Middle East. Everything I know about the Middle East comes from what I learned from students that I work with, or from my interaction with faculty. So I enjoy hearing, not for any particular other reason, but just it's educational for me to hear about the Lebanese case and how it played out, because I'm not an expert on it. I don't know it. Okay, so the right to the city literature and how it fits. I think what Mona mentioned is correct. Because Lefebvre does talk about this reappropriation of space and the struggle over space and so on. But the conflicts that are there in the right to the city are mostly localized, and they're not about seizing control over the government and the dynamics that occur within that. And to some extent, that is the right to the city literature is very important for connecting the ordinary to the extraordinary potentially, but it doesn't deal with the extraordinary, right? And so my book is about the extraordinary, not the ordinary. And so I think that there is a potential for interaction between the two. The city as a performative stage. Why didn't I address that? I think that as a place for imagining an alternative society. Absolutely. And it's not really fully addressed. I talk about it a little bit in passing in some of the cases, but it's not something that I really theoretically address, but it is the case that crowds are the place where often this becomes. It's not where it's necessarily imagined, because I think it can be imagined elsewhere, but where it becomes personified in people. Who don't necessarily know each other and are an imagined community in the Andersonian way, but also imagining a representation of the alternative, of the alternative society that potentially wants to make itself felt. What to hang on to, what to cling to. It is the fact that revolutions sometimes do succeed. In fact, they succeed more often than we would expect them to succeed. And often that's because regimes make mistakes. The odds are stacked against revolutionaries, but regimes make mistakes, and sometimes revolutionaries do win. They win more often than we would expect them to win. But what happens after revolution is not necessarily what happens in revolution. And that's one of the points of the book, that we need to pay much more attention about what happens after revolution and the factors that shape what revolutionaries make of revolution. You know, there are processes, natural processes towards fragmentation. Post-revolutionary situations are the most difficult situations in which to govern, without a doubt. Economically, there are always economic problems after revolutions. There's almost always an explosion of crime after revolutions because the police have been attacked, and I mean there are many, many problems that are naturally there, in addition to the problems of holding together a revolutionary coalition. And the problem of counter-revolution, which is you know, clearly a threat for all of these revolutions. So we need to theorize this a little bit more, and I kind of think of my book in that regard as kind of an opening conversation and not as an answer, because I think that you know, the challenges of gaining power are considerable, but we haven't taken advantage as best as we could of the opportunities that we have once we do gain power. And then I'll just say one other thing: the role of small cities. Yeah, sometimes, I mean, revolutions assume different patterns. Sometimes they start in smaller cities and make their way to larger cities. They almost always have to end in large cities, in proximity to centers of power, to the nerve centers of power. They want to seize those nerve centers of power. But sometimes they start in capital cities. And in fact, one of the things I show in the book is that over time, populations have been concentrating much, much more in capital cities. So if you go back to 1900, it was maybe only 7% of a population of countries lived in capital cities in countries on average. And today it's like 17%. So there is much more concentration of people in close proximity, but revolutions do follow these different patterns. I haven't sorted them out. I think it's a great project for follow-up. I'm hoping to try to look at this in a little bit more detail, but I think there's a lot that can be done. So again, I sort of see the book as kind of trying to open up some conversation, open up some space for thinking about these questions that if the book is already kind of thick, you can imagine what would happen to the binding if I addressed all of these. So why don't I just end with that?
Okay. Maybe some questions? Yes, please. And please introduce yourself. Questions?
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. My name is Rana Soukariye, an incoming Assistant Professor in Sociology at AUB. I want to build on Alexandra's comments and focus. My question specifically is on the consent. You said that the revolution are right now concentrated in time, and you gave an example of like 58 days or something like this. Okay, there's a compression of time. So there is a focus on the visibility of the revolution, and I'm afraid that when we focus only on what is visible, there's a lot of things that we may miss, and we may theorize some theories that can be totally and easily contested. So, for example, neglecting the small cities. In the case of Tunisia, for example, the revolution did not start in Tunisia, the city. It started in small cities earlier, 3 years maybe before that. So that's my first question. Second one is very quick. The data set, what is missing in the data set? To say that in almost 100 years, there's only 350 revolutions or something like this. What is left out? Do you consider, for example, the anti-colonial revolution that took place in most third world countries in the 1960s. Is that one revolution or is that 150 revolutions? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hayes Buchanan. I'm a researcher at the Beirut Urban Lab. This is a topic of interest to me. I wrote 11 questions, but I'm only going to ask one. I was hoping you'd say that. So my question is, are contemporary protest movements insufficiently concerned with targeting the nerve centers of the state? I guess, moreover, my question is about the implications of your research for practice. So what critiques would you level at modern movements, and what advice would you address to would-be revolutionaries? Thanks.
Does anyone have any more questions?
Hello, I would like to emphasize on what you mentioned, that the last wave of revolutions took place in the city centers. In the centers of political institutions and economic activities. By observing these places of revolution, especially the most active one, can we notice a clear or remarkable change or impact on the city? For example, morphological one, the state or the officials are changing streets to become more narrow, or maybe these places become less attractive by people. This is my first question. And my second question, what about the upcoming future protests and revolutions? Could it be virtual, on internet? And what will the physical place will become always attracted by the people, by protesters? Thanks.
Yeah, okay, so let's see. What is missed in the data? Well, first of all, the data only includes episodes of that mobilized 1,000 people or more. Okay, so there are plenty of things which are probably below that threshold that one could, label as revolutionary, but the fact is that when I looked at those cases, and I kept track of the ones that I rejected, so you can look at those and see which ones are, were left out. When I looked at these ones that were smaller than 1,000, all of them pretty much were failed. Not pretty much, all of them were failed episodes. So mass mobilization is quite clearly critical to the outcomes. Anti-colonial revolutions are included in the data set. Not all decolonization occurred through revolutionary processes. Some of it occurred from above. In fact, a good deal of it occurred from above, or in response to movements, but not through a seizure of power. Okay, so there were anti-colonial movements, but didn't necessarily, become revolutionary, in essence. So it does include all of those. You can look at the data set and see what you think is missing. Happy to entertain thoughts about that. I actually anticipate many people will say, "Oh, why did you include that case and not include this case?" That's natural in an exercise like this. But actually, if you look at historians and how about their analyses of a single revolution, they don't agree on even a single revolution. So we're going to have disagreements about this. I invite you to take the data set, create your own, do another analysis. I think it would be good. What critiques would I level at modern movements? What would be my advice for would-be revolutionaries? Be realistic about what can happen, and sometimes change through the ballot box might be a better strategy than change through revolution, but often not, right? And so Part of what's happening now in the world, one of the reasons why we've seen a decline in successful revolutions, we actually see, since my book, there have been many revolutionary episodes. They have had a lower rate of success than the ones that I describe in the book. And part of that is that regimes are learning how to deal with the urban civic repertoire, how to displace it, how to attack it, without reading my book, okay? So I'm not food for counter-revolution. I'm describing what's going on in the world. You do see this sort of relationship between people who participate between revolutionary episodes. And revolutionary episodes occur repetitively in societies. There are many societies in which you have more than one. And they often they often occur in some societies, especially when they don't produce, they occur again. So the point of the book is not to discourage people from revolution, it's to be realistic about revolution, to understand also that once you gain power, that's not the end of the story, that's the beginning of the story. And that to understand that this is a difficult thing that has to be done. Then let's see, last thing, let's see, the virtual or physical in space. So revolutions cannot unfold in virtual space, okay, virtually. They can be coordinated virtually, but in order to engage in disruption, the kind of disruption that would produce, maybe you can do some disruption online, but it's not sufficient to cause a regime to go away. Causing a regime to go away is a hard thing to achieve, and the only way to do that is through a significant enough disruption that causes defections from a regime's coalition and physically evicts them from power. So that's not going to happen, just simply virtually. That said, the internet obviously is a very powerful tool for coordination. It does, however, accentuate many of the problems that I'm talking about in the book. There's the problems of, by mobilizing very large numbers, you have a fragmented coalition, you have an absence of leadership and an absence of strategic leadership. The kinds of things that, social revolutions actually, they excelled at that. Social revolutions were able to have much more impact on society because they had coherent leaderships. So we have to realize that the way in which we are engaging in revolution today leads to natural problems that we have to figure out solutions. I don't have a solution, but I'm just saying that I do identify the problem.
Hello, my name is Isabella Serhan. I work at the Beirut Urban Lab. I just have a small question. You mentioned that the work starts after a revolution, not during the revolution itself, and that most revolutions are happening in a way that unites people in what they stand against rather than what they stand for. So and yet you had very clear charts with numbers, like a lot of quantitative data. I'm just wondering, what are the indicators for success of a revolution that you used? Like toppling a regime? So toppling the regime, like policy change or something like that, would not qualify as a success. So just kind of like a bit of a comment on that, like what the revolution was able to achieve.
Thanks. I just have also, maybe I felt that there is a tension between the way you theorize the so-called urban civic revolution and us here, the way at least we imagine, or at least the way we have experienced these waves of what I call popular, protest or uprisings. So there is a huge contribution of yours that is, how you model the revolution, this multiple approach, methodological approach, quantitative, qualitative, data-based, case studies, etc. But this modeling also excludes. It excludes the politics, the ideology, at least the way I heard the presentation and read parts of the books. I felt that this so-called revolution is apolitical, is depoliticized, is post-ideological. What does it excludes? It excludes the everyday life, maybe the periphery, some revolutions that took place in the periphery, Morocco, for instance, Tunisia, you mentioned. So understand that we cannot, account for everything, but my question is the following. Are we talking about revolutionary episodes, the way you explain it in the book, inspired by revolutionary moments of Charles Tilly, or we're talking about revolutions? So what are we talking about? Are we talking about episodes that have put pressure on the structure of power but didn't manage to topple it down? Or we're talking about successful revolutions that achieve, some political gains in relation to structural change in power? If it's only, the urban civic revolution as an episode, then the analysis and the model may be valid, and we all felt that this is the case. But are we talking also about revolutions that radically change the structure of power or not?
Let me deal with that last question. Some do, but it doesn't. Some do change the structure of power, but it's much more difficult when you have a coalition of people that don't necessarily agree on what it is they want to achieve. So the task of radically changing the structure of power is about trying to hold together such a coalition in the wake of revolution, and yet at the same time achieve change. Okay, so it's not an easy task. But that's what's necessary, and we see too many cases in which the revolutionary coalition breaks apart, and the regime doesn't last very long. It doesn't last very long. It gets reversed. We also know, the problems, as I described, the problems of post-revolutionary societies are considerable. So it is a really challenging environment to try to govern in, but that's the task, essentially, that's there. And I think by not, the temptation for revolutionaries is to push change quickly, but in ways that might break apart your revolutionary coalition. But in some ways, holding your revolutionary coalition together might be more important in terms of keeping stability and control, right? So that you can, over a number of years, implement change. If I had to provide, some kind of advice about how to deal with in the post-revolutionary period, the change occurs over a number of years in the post-revolutionary period. At least when you're mobilizing on the basis of the power of numbers. If you're mobilizing on the basis of a vanguard party, like a social revolution, that's different. Then waiting, maybe, over time is very different. But you take a look at Ukraine. And so I should say also, some of the big changes that have occurred in the wake of urban civic revolutions occur because of the desire, because of external events in some ways. They have pushed change. In Ukraine, the first revolution failed. It succeeded in gaining power. It failed dramatically in terms of governance, to the point that within 2 years, the opposition came back to power. Not the opposition, the old regime came back to power. The old regime came back to power at the ballot box. They were voted back into power. We look at Tunisia, right? What's happening in Tunisia? The problems, it unfolded a little bit more slowly in Tunisia, but the same problems unfolded in Tunisia. In Greece. So you have this tendency, and part of it is the ability to hold together the coalition. In both of these cases, in Tunisia, in Ukraine, the revolutionary coalition fragmented. In Ukraine right now, you have, by contrast, a lot of substantive change happening after Euromaidan, largely because of the Russian invasion. Not so much because of the revolution itself, but because the Russian invasion of Crimea and Donbass pushed a sense of urgency for change and held that, held the coalition together to some extent, created a coalition. Okay, so then let's see. Success, what is success? Well, I think success is, we have to think about it, as I was saying, in two ways. One is gaining power, but the other is substantive change. However, even in the case of failed revolutions, sometimes change happens. And so one of my PhD students, Chantal Berman, did a comparison of Tunisia and Morocco, and particularly the phosphate mining communities in Tunisia and Morocco. It's a very interesting dissertation that she's publishing as a book. She spent a lot of time in the phosphate mining communities. What she found was actually in the aftermath of failed revolution in Morocco, that community, the phosphate mining community, actually achieved more because the government was scared of the threat of revolution, and therefore they tried to co-opt the phosphate mining population. Now, the deeper structural problems of Morocco were not addressed, but nevertheless, there was this co-optation process. So, change is complex. It's not, you can't easily characterize it. One of the points of the book, I don't try to stuff everything into categories. I think we look at patterns, but we also look at how things deviate from patterns, and we try to explain why do they deviate from those patterns. They're not everything fits into one box, but there are reasons why, and those are themselves interesting.
Okay, I guess that's it for now. Thanks everyone, and thanks Mark for this very good presentation, and congratulations for the book again. Thanks Mona, and thanks Alexandra.